Good evening and welcome to our panel discussion entitled Hidden Figures, a celebration of the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, the hidden contributions of women of color, and the journey we have traveled. My name is Veronica Cope, and I am the judge-elect of the Gwinnett State Court. And I also have the pleasure of serving as the president of the Georgia Association for Women Lawyers. GAWL's mission is to enhance the welfare and development of women lawyers and to celebrate their interests. Last month, on August 18th, we celebrated the 100th anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment. Tonight, we have been joined by an amazing group of women, legal scholars, and lawyers to discuss the history of the fight for enfranchisement for women and to celebrate contributions of women of color who have often been left out of the conversation surrounding women's suffrage movement. We are excited to have with us this evening as our panelist, former Chief Justice Leah Ward Sears, currently a partner at Smith, Gambrell and Russell. We also are joined by former Georgia Secretary of State and current Dean of the Mercer University School of Law, Kathy Cox, Professor Lori Ringhand of the University of Georgia School of Law, Carlise Greer, the past president of the Fulton County chapter of the League of Women Voters, and Phi Nguyen, the director of litigation for Asian Americans Advancing Justice. Tonight, I am honored to co-host this event along with the Georgia Association of Black Women Attorneys and the Gate City Bar Association. I will now turn it over to Kimberly Burrows, who will bring you greetings from the Georgia Association of Black Women Attorneys.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you so very much for being with us tonight. In 1981, 3 Black women lawyers at that time forever changed the legal landscape in Georgia when they founded, along with 10 other founding members, the Georgia Association of Black Women Lawyers. Our purpose is to focus on women and children's issues, to increase Black female representation in the judiciary and in public offices, and to take a proactive stance on political issues. We do so by nurturing and supporting and galvanizing the power of Black women attorneys, by advocating for women and children, and empowering our communities. Since that time, they, along with so many other women, have paved the way for us in the legal profession, where we serve and represent Black women attorneys in law firms, government, the judiciary, elected office, and throughout the Georgia Bar. Tonight, I'm honored to co-sponsor this event with my fellow bar leaders, dear friends, and sisters-in-law to celebrate the 19th Amendment, to pay homage to the women who have lit the way and guided us along our journey. Thank you so very much for being with us tonight. Welcome, everyone. Karen, you're on mute.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. My name is Karen Cloud, and I am serving as the president of the Gate City Bar Association. And I am so excited to join all of you this evening for this exceptional program. When Veronica approached me and Kimberly about this idea, we were over the moon. We were so glad that she chose our organizations to partner with for this important recognition. And as a Gate City Bar Association, one of our main tenets is to focus on social justice in the local community and across the state of Georgia. And so I can think of no better opportunity and no better time for us to shine a spotlight on all the contributions of women over the last 100 years and the importance of voting, especially as we approach this next election. So I thank all of you for joining us this evening. I think it is going to be exceptional. Our panel is exceptional. And I am just as excited as you are to hear all that they have to say. So thank you.
So now that you can actually see me, just a few housekeeping matters before I introduce our dynamic moderator for the evening. First, feel free to ask questions throughout our conversation tonight. We have our question and answer features that you can ask questions of our panelists, and we will incorporate those questions throughout this evening's event. We'll be monitoring that. Also for our lawyers, GAWL has applied for 1.5 hours of CLE credit. If you would like to receive credit, please email your name, your bar number to GAWL, so GAWL.programs@gmail.com. I'll repeat that information later with the subject line hidden figures. And GAWL will submit the appropriate documentation to the State Bar on your behalf. So again, welcome. I now have the distinct pleasure of introducing our distinguished moderator for the evening. Tanya Washington Hicks is a professor of law at Georgia State University College of Law for over 17 years. She earned her JD from the University of Maryland School of Law and then clerked for Associate Judge Robert M. Bell on the Maryland Court of Appeals. After practicing as a toxic tort defense litigator in the Baltimore and Washington, D.C. offices of Piper and Marbury, Professor Washington Hicks completed the A. Leon Higginbotham Jr. Fellowship in Social Justice and the Albert M. Sachs Fellowship in Criminal Justice under the direction of Professor Charles Ogletree. She then earned her LLM from Harvard Law School. Professor Washington Hicks teaches civil procedure, family law, education law, and race and law at Georgia State College of Law. She is taught as an adjunct professor at Howard Law School and the David A. Clark Law School at the University of the District of Columbia. She has also taught comparative law classes on race, affirmative action, and domestic violence in study abroad programs in Brazil, Austria, and China. Her research, scholarship, and teaching focus on issues related to educational equity, domestic violence, racial justice and equity, inclusion and diversity, marriage equality, gender equity, and children's constitutional rights make her the perfect moderator for this evening's discussion. Please join me in welcoming our moderator for the evening, Professor Tanya Washington Hicks.
Hi, everyone. Greetings. Welcome to this event. Before we get started, I can't think of a better way to formally open this program than with a moment of silence that allows us to reflect on the life and legacy of Justice Ginsburg. May she rest in peace and power. So let's open with a moment of silence in her honor. Thank you for that. I am so honored to be able to moderate what I'm sure is going to be a lively and thought-provoking discussion among amazing women who represent a number of firsts in their own rights. And I look forward to helping to facilitate a conversation that allows our audience to really appreciate the contributions and the contributions that these women have made to the expansion of the right to vote for women across the nation and certainly here in the state of Georgia and in the southern region. So we're going to start with a brief sprint through history, and then we're going to try something a little different. The panelists are going to introduce themselves in response to a question about the contribution that they've made to the expansion of the franchise that they are most proud of. So you will get a chance to hear from them what they think about their role in this important constitutional right. So I'm going to, I hope everyone can see my screen. I'm going to start with 1848, which is where a lot of scholars start when they're talking about the expansion of the franchise to include women. However, it's important to note that women prior to this convention that took place in Seneca Falls, New York, had been thinking about and working towards securing voting rights for women. When I did research on this particular convention, it was made clear that Frederick Douglass was there, and there were about 300 other attendees. There were no women of color reportedly at the convention, and none of them spoke, which may have provoked Sojourner Truth to deliver her famous "Ain't I a Woman" speech at the National Women's Rights Convention 3 years later in 1851, where she called the question on the role of Black women in the suffrage movement. In 1865, slavery ends, and that's an important date because at this point in history, women suffragists had to decide whether they were going to support the expansion of the franchise to include, at that time, Black men in the context of the 15th Amendment. And there were some organizations that did support that. Susan B. Anthony's organization, the National Women's Suffrage Association, took the position that the franchise should not be extended to Black men before it was also extended to include women. We have the passage of the 15th Amendment in 1870, and then in 1896, we have a group of Black women, Harriet Tubman, Frances E.W. Harper, Ida B. Wells Barnett, and Mary Church Terrell, founding the National Association of Colored Women, formally giving voice to the collective call for the right of Black women to enjoy the franchise. And then in 1913, we have Black women suffragists and other Black activists, including my sorority sisters, Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated, marching at the back of a segregated national suffrage parade on the eve of Woodrow Wilson's inauguration. And this march highlights the nature of the movement, where there was still a racial division between Black women and white women seeking the right to vote. In that same year, Alice Paul founds the Congressional Union for Women's Suffrage, which would become the National Women's Party. And we have several years later, Jeanette Rankin being elected to the US House of Representatives, representing the first woman to serve in Congress. President Wilson officially changed his position. And in 1919, Georgia becomes the first state to vote against ratification of the 19th Amendment of the US Constitution. And some scholars believe that that inspired other Southern states to oppose the ratification of the amendment, of the Constitution to include the amendment. And finally, in 1920, we have Tennessee becoming the 36th state to vote in support of ratification. And the 19th Amendment is passed, and that is what we have most recently celebrated on the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment. In 1922, we have Rebecca Latimer Felton appointed to the US Senate from Georgia. She served one day. I believe she was 85 years old when she was appointed, but she is the first woman to be seated in the US Senate from Georgia. And I'm sorry, from the US, but she was a Georgia senator. And 10 years later, we have the first elected woman in Hattie Caraway to the US Senate. In 1964, we have Margaret Chase Smith placed in nomination at the Republican National Convention. So she was the first nominee of a major party, first female nominee of a major party. And in 1965, we have the passage of the Voting Rights Act, which realized the right to vote for most Black women in America. So there's this span of time between the passage of the 15th Amendment when Black men were, where the right to vote was protected for Black men, at least in theory. And then we have this period of time during which Black women were not permitted to exercise the right to vote even after the passage of the 19th Amendment. In 1969, we have Shirley Chisholm being elected the first Black woman to the House of Representatives. And the next year she places her nomination. She's placed in nomination at the Democratic National Convention, making her the first woman to enjoy that honor on the Democratic side and the second woman to be nominated to a major party for president. In 1981, we have Sandra Day O'Connor nominated and seated on the US Supreme Court. Then we have Geraldine Ferraro nominated to run for vice president in 84. 1992, Carol Moseley Braun became the first Black woman elected to the US Senate. And in 2016, Hillary Rodham Clinton was named Democratic nominee, which represented a first as well. In 2018, Stacey Abrams was elected Democratic gubernatorial nominee for Georgia, and she was the first Black woman to be nominated for a gubernatorial position in the Southern region. And in 2020, we have Kamala Harris nominated to run for vice president, and Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg being the first woman to lie in state at the US Capitol. And I know a lot of people have raised the question about Rosa Parks lying in state at the Capitol, but she lay in honor. She was not a public official. And so the characterization of the memorial is different if you're a public official versus a private citizen. But I go through this timeline to highlight two important points. First, we are still experiencing firsts in 2020, which is astonishing. That as we speak, there are still things that women have not been able to do. And those limitations are directly related to the exercise of the franchise and our need to not only participate as voters, but also to participate as candidates and assuming our rightful place in these seats of power. And the second point I would like to highlight is that in this moment, I want us to reflect on the fact that it's easy to highlight specific accomplishments on a timeline, but in between all of these accomplishments, there were people who sacrificed and struggled and fought to realize these accomplishments. They were not handed to women. They are the result of concerted and shared efforts and determination. And that is what it is going to take for us to continue the path forward. So this just gives us a roadmap and some inspiration. And so the question becomes, and I hope we'll be able to answer this as part of our discussion today, what is the next step for women along this historical trajectory? And I know that our panelists are going to inspire us with some direction and some advice in that regard. So turning now to our amazing collection of panelists, I am going to allow them to introduce themselves by asking them to tell a story that describes their role in furtherance of women having access to the ballot and the struggles or challenges that they faced along the way and how they have responded to those in ways that allowed them to continue to move forward in that work. I'm going to start with Professor Ringhand, and then we will move to Justice Sears, followed by Attorney Greer, Attorney Nguyen, and Dean Cox.
Thank you so much, Professor Washington. It is really an honor to be here with this amazing group of women and attorneys here in Georgia. So I'm Lori Ringhand. I'm a law professor at the University of Georgia, and I work with constitutional law and election law. And when the question came and told us we were going to introduce ourselves by talking about our contribution, I thought, boy, that one's hard, because I looked at my panelists and I thought, like, wow, there's not going to be much I can say here. But I thought about the question and I kind of reframed it a bit as the thing I am proud of having done. And as I mentioned, I teach constitutional law and election law here at the University of Georgia Law School. And what that means is I have a lot of exchanges with students, including young women students and students of color, who are interested in politics. And I noticed over the years of teaching my election law class and talking to kind of this pool of students who are interested in these issues, over and over and over again, I heard young women when I asked, what do you want to do when you grow up? And I heard young women say, I want to be the governor's chief of staff, or I want to work for a US senator. And I thought, wait a minute, why are you wanting to be the governor's chief of staff? You need to want to be the governor. So I started actively talking to all the young women students that I interact with and telling them, you can do this, think about doing this. Why aren't you thinking about doing this? You would be great at this. And that culminated a few years ago in an event called Georgia Women Run that we had here at the law school that brought together women from across Georgia who had ran for different offices, a diverse group, a bipartisan group. And they met with and talked to our law students and tried to get that message out that you can do this. You should be thinking about taking that next step. Don't just be involved, run for office yourself, because that's how you're going to effectuate change. So, thank you.
Thank you. I moderated a panel with Donna Brazil a number of years ago, and she said that women have to be asked 11 times to run for office or to consider running for office before they give in and concede that they may actually be competent to do so, while men only need to be asked one time. And so.
Or not at all.
Touche. So we will now move on to Justice Sears' theme question. And I love the way you reframed it, Professor Ringham. So feel free to play with the question to respond in terms of your contribution that you're most proud of.
Am I unmuted?
Yes.
Okay, good. But you can see me, is that right?
Yes.
Okay, very good. Thank you very much, Professor Washington. I appreciate I appreciate the opportunity to appear before everybody. My name is Leah Ward Sears. I served for 17 years as a justice on the Supreme Court of Georgia. Before that, I was a Superior Court judge on the Fulton County Superior Court. I was the first woman Superior Court judge in Fulton County, and I was the first woman Supreme Court justice in the state of Georgia. In running and retaining my seat in Georgia, my Supreme Court judgeship, I became the first woman to run and win a contested statewide race in Georgia back in 1992. So the question that we were sent was, and I'm currently a partner in the law firm of Smith, Gambrell, and Russell, where I do a lot of appellate work, and I love doing that. Let me tell you how I got into this judgeship thing. I knew Andrea Young, whose father was Andrew Young, many years ago. And we are contemporaries. We're exactly the same age, give or take a month or so. And years ago, this is in the early 80s, because I graduated from law school at Emory Law School in 1980. Andrew Young was searching around for women, and Black women in particular, African-American women, to put on the benches and to begin the process of diversifying the judgeships in Georgia, which they were not. I mean, when I came along, there were three or four women Superior Court judges in the entire state of Georgia. Three, I think. I was the fourth when I got elected in 1988. And he picked me to go on the traffic court. And then about 4 years later, that's the City of Atlanta Traffic Court, I decided to run for a Superior Court judgeship in Fulton Superior Court. Why did I do that? We were vacationing down in the islands somewhere, and an older judge announced he was retiring, and people started calling me. And I had just had a child, and I think it was in 1988, so that had to, well, it was my youngest child, my daughter, who's now in her 30s. And I can't run. My daughter's only one. She's a baby. I can't do that. And my husband at the time, we're no longer together. I'm married to someone else, but said to me, I knew you weren't going to run because women always do that. They are afraid to take risks. And this kind of goes into what we were talking about. They're afraid to take risks. You're just going to sit around and wait for somebody to appoint you someday. And then you might run then after you've been appointed, but it takes guts to get out there and run, and women don't generally have that. And I became so enraged and incensed, I decided to run. I took up the challenge. I think he was prodding me. I think that's what he wanted me to do. And with my 1-year-old notwithstanding, I went out there and ran and won. And I decided just never to sit around and wait for somebody to call my name from some list ever again. If I wanted something, go out and take it just like men do. And I think that's a contribution I've tried to make. I've tried to tell other women, don't sit around waiting for appointments or the phone call or something like that. Power has to be taken. And that is what it is. It's power has to be seized. So anyway, that's enough about me for right now. Thanks again for this opportunity.
Well, thank you for that insightful answer. I know I'm inspired. Anger can provoke action.
Yeah.
Attorney Greer. You're muted. Mm-hmm.
Hi, my name is Carlise Greer. I'm an attorney in Atlanta, and I am honored to be here with several role models and folks who have inspired me along the way. I want to talk a little bit about, I guess, life phases and some of the different things that I've done throughout the years. As a young attorney, I was the chair of what was then called the State Bar's Women and Minorities in the Profession Committee. It's now the Committee to Promote Inclusion in the Profession. And one of the things that we did, partnering with GABWA and GAWL, is to put on a CLE, and it was originally a GAWL CLE actually, but Jill Pryor, who was a member of the committee at the time, now a judge on the 11th Circuit, talked with GAWL, and they gave us permission to use the idea as a springboard. And we did a day-long CLE called Georgia Women on the Run for Office. And it included at that time people like Judge Denise Majette, who is groundbreaking and later ran for Congress. Unfortunately has had some personal challenges, and we don't hear her name much anymore. But she was an inspiration for a lot of folks my age at that time. So doing some things through the State Bar to talk about women running for office and how do you do that and what's involved. That was one of the first things that I did. A little bit later in my career, I did some phone banking actually for Justice Leah Ward Sears. I don't know if she remembers that, but she, as she said, she had a contested election, and a friend of mine and I, Carla Young, we were working in the Fulton County Solicitor's Office at the time, and after work, we would go over to her headquarters and pull out lists. You actually had hard paper copy lists at that time and call people and encourage them to go vote. I myself at one time ran for office, and I want to congratulate Judge-elect Veronica Cope, because even, I ran and said, okay, I've had enough. Sometimes you don't make that breakthrough the first time, and I think Judge-elect Cope knows that, but she has persevered, and congratulations. I look forward to seeing you being sworn in. In my role as a former president of the League of Women Voters of Atlanta, Fulton County, I really struggle to try and make the organization a place of common ground for people of different political views. Even though you're a Democrat or Republican, there are some things that we can agree on, and looking for that common ground and trying to create a space where people could have honest conversation, respectful conversation, perhaps respectful disagreement, but to promote as women that we don't have to buy into this very toxic political environment that we are in now. And that was a different way. I canvassed for a political presidential candidate in 2012 in a battleground state, going door to door on the weekend before election day, trying to get folks to go vote. I've served as a delegate at a political convention. Now with my current role, the job that I hold, which shall remain nameless because I'm not here in that capacity, I do nonpartisan election protection work. I called my boss last year and said, election day is going to be a vacation day for me. I'm going to work the hotlines because I wanted him to hear it from me versus someone else that might see me there. And then just personally, I have a listserv and I send people reminders about voting and voting information. And so there have been different things that I could do in my career based on where I was at that time. And I've done a lot of different things and just tried to pitch in where I can behind the scenes. So that's me. Professor Washington, you're on.
Sorry, I was thanking you, Attorney Greer, and passing the mic to Attorney Nguyen.
Hi, everyone. First, I just want to thank GAWL, GABWA, and Gate City again for inviting me to be part of this conversation with so many wonderful and inspiring women, and moderated by Professor Washington, who was actually my professor at Georgia State, though I don't know if she remembers, but I was in your race law class, and that was my favorite class in law school. So thank you. My name, again, is Phi Nguyen, and I'm the litigation director of Asian Americans Advancing Justice Atlanta. My work there really lies at the intersection of immigrant justice and voting rights. So for Asian American immigrants, the right to vote was historically tied to the right to become a citizen in this country. And the laws that blocked certain Asian immigrants from becoming citizens were not actually entirely lifted until 1952. So today, the challenges that Asian Americans face to full political participation and civic engagement, which range, I think, from cultural barriers to anti-immigrant policies, are still often tied to, in some way, to our migration histories to the US. And the story that I want to share with you is actually about my mom. It is, I think, illustrative of some of the common barriers that Asian Americans face at the polls. And it's really a jumping off point for my current voting rights work. So in 2016, after I found out that Asian Americans historically have the lowest voter turnout of all racial groups in the US, I decided to spearhead a grassroots effort to register more Vietnamese voters in Georgia. And during this time, I realized that my own mom was not registered to vote. Now, my mom fled to the US as a refugee from Vietnam over 40 years ago in 1979. She was 27 at the time, and she became a mom shortly after resettling in America. Because of that, she didn't go back to school, she didn't work outside of the home, and instead she did the full-time job of raising me and my sisters and running the household. So having fled from an authoritarian regime, my mom hates politics and she sees it as a dirty word. So when I decided to help register her to vote in 2016, I first had to convince her, in my second grade Vietnamese, by the way, why she should vote. So after that, after moving heaven and earth, I helped her request an absentee ballot because she was intimidated by the idea of going to the polls and navigating the voting process entirely in English. But then she lost her absentee ballot. So she ended up having to go to the polls anyway, and she went with my dad on election day. And because of the issue with her absentee ballot, they actually incorrectly turned her away at the polls. So she goes home, she's humiliated. She feels like she tried to do something wrong, and she has zero intention of going back to the polls. Luckily, her annoying daughter is a little bit more persistent. And at the time, I was still practicing medical malpractice defense, which is what I did for 8 years after I graduated from law school. So I was in the middle of taking an expert witness deposition, but during breaks, I was frantically texting my mom, and I was talking to my friend Raymond, who at the time worked at Advancing Justice Atlanta. And I was talking to Raymond because I was trying to see if he could, from Atlanta, help my mom who lives in Augusta. So Raymond from Atlanta gets on the phone with the poll manager at my mom's precinct in Augusta, confirms that she can go back to the polls, cancel her absentee ballot, and vote in person. And he also lines up a Vietnamese interpreter who can provide my mom language assistance over the phone if she ends up needing it. Beautiful, right? Amazing. Thank you, Raymond. And then my mom says to me, yeah, I don't want to go back. So here I go again, trying to move heaven and earth to try to convince her that yes, she should go back, that this election in particular is crucial. And after a lot of convincing, she finally decides to drive herself back to the polls, and she votes. Although she texted me from the parking lot, and she said, okay, I'm gonna go in, but if I get turned away again, I'm going to kill you. And my mom has never threatened to kill me before. But so that was in November of 2016. And about 6 months later, I quit my job at the law firm I was working at and began working at Advancing Justice Atlanta, where I try to empower many voters like my mom to go to the polls. And I also do voting rights litigation to try to remove some of the barriers to the polls. So that's my story.
Oh, that is a wonderful story. That's a wonderful story. And I'm so glad that you highlighted that there are, these kind of structural, material, concrete barriers, but then there are also the barriers that are based on people's perception and feeling about whether they are welcome to vote, whether they're welcome to participate, and the work that you're doing is addressing both of those. And so I'm really proud of you as a GSU grad.
Thank you.
And last but certainly not least, Dean Cox.
Thank you, Professor Washington, and good evening to all of you. It's a pleasure to be a part of this program with so many of my friends and sheroes. My story, many of you know, in 1998, I decided to run for Secretary of State in Georgia, and we had never had a woman running for Secretary of State or serving as Secretary of State. So I vividly remember the campaign because there was not a week during that campaign that someone did not say to me, I don't know if a woman can do this job. And I would have to say time after time, the job does not involve heavy lifting. And I would have to explain what the work of the Secretary of State was, and that really, trust me, a woman could do this job. And it was stunning to me after having practiced law for a while in Georgia, and even in rural Georgia where I lived, and I had been the first woman elected to the legislature from my little corner of rural Southwest Georgia. And I could tell stories about that all night as well. But I was shocked, I guess to say, throughout that campaign at the surprise of voters. But it's like we've alluded to already tonight, until you see it, people just don't believe it or don't have a feel for it. And it's sad that we're still experiencing so many of these first because we haven't seen women in those roles. But fortunately, I won that race in 1998 and went on to run again and win re-election in 2002. And so I served over those 8 years as Secretary of State in Georgia, and really became passionate about voting rights during that time. I suppose in my sheltered and privileged life of growing up, I had a father who was in politics and who served in the legislature for 16 years. And so I was familiar with elections, familiar somewhat with voting laws, but I never knew the depth of voter suppression efforts until I became Secretary of State. I certainly didn't see it in my dad's races. He never really had a contested race after his first one. And so growing up, I wasn't privy enough to see the things that I began to see on a statewide basis, and understand the incredible importance of the Voting Rights Act and the pre-clearance process that has now been stricken because of the Shelby decision. But we can come back to that topic later. But during my terms as Secretary of State, I tried to make a lot of improvements to make it easier for people to vote, just like Fee's story, for people who were not native English speakers, for people who were not accustomed to the process, who didn't grow up in the process like me, of doing all kinds of things to open up the process. So during my terms as Secretary of State, we were able to get the legislature to pass the laws for early voting. But it took me 5 years to get the Georgia legislature to pass the early voting law that we have now on the books. Because during those 5 years, both the Democrats and the Republicans all thought, well, who's it going to help and who's it going to hurt? And even though I was a Democrat, even my Democrats were suspicious. Well, does she know what she's talking about? It really might not help us. It might hurt the other party more. And there was such a partisan debate about it. The first year I proposed it, I proposed a 45-day early voting period, then a 30-day early voting period, then 21 days, then 2 weeks. So the first early voting period we got was 1 week. And after we put that in place, everybody went out and voted early and swamped the early voting polling places. So the counties then screamed, give us some relief. It's got to be a longer period because too many people took advantage of it. So then they expanded it to 2 weeks, then they expanded it to 4 weeks. Now they've shrunk it back to 3 weeks. So I'm really proud that we were able to get early voting, which people now cannot imagine that we could live without. I also got the legislature to take away the excuses that you used to have to put on the ballot for absentees. Some of you who are old enough to remember, you could only use an absentee ballot or a mail-in ballot if you were going to be out of town, or you were over 65, or you had a disability, or you lied and said you were going to be out of town because you wanted the convenience of voting by mail. And so we finally got the legislature to wipe out all of those reasons. We initially called it no excuse absentee balloting. Now we just call it absentee ballots or mail-in ballots. It's all the same. You request it just because you want the convenience of it. And of course, here this year in these pandemic times, we've seen voters by the millions take advantage of that option to vote by mail. And so I'm so proud that we already had that in place ahead of a lot of states. There's still states that do not allow you to vote by mail or to vote early even in some states. So thank goodness we were ahead of the pack in putting some of those voting improvements in place. I also put in the first electronic voting in Georgia back after the 2000 Bush versus Gore presidential election, which many of you remember the nightmare on election night with the voting judges and the magnifying glasses looking at the hanging chads, and people are wondering what the hanging chad of 2020 is going to be. But the truth is we had a mess in Georgia prior to the 2000 election. Every county got to have whatever type of voting equipment they wanted to. There was no coordination on the state level, no ability to do statewide education programs. So we overhauled all of that and put in the first statewide electronic voting system in the nation in 2002. Caltech and MIT said we went from one of the worst voting accuracy states to one of the top 2 after we made those improvements. I'm delighted we finally have upgraded that to new equipment that we have this year that has the paper ballot that you can actually look at on paper and can be audited, which we didn't have available to us in 2002. But a lot of those improvements have certainly heightened people's interest and awareness in voting, have given us much more convenience in the voting process. There's still ways that we can improve the voting process. Some of those have slid backwards because of some of the policies the legislature has enacted in recent years. And certainly when the Supreme Court issued the Shelby opinion and took away the pre-clearance process, Georgia was among many states that went backwards in some of its voting policies, I'm sad to say, but there's always hope for tomorrow, and women can always be at the forefront of those initiatives.
Absolutely, and thank you, Dean Cox, for highlighting nonpartisan efforts to expand the exercise of the franchise, because it doesn't have to be tied to a political party. The idea could be that we are better and healthier as a democracy when more people rather than fewer people can vote. And that should be the truth regardless of which party you are supporting. So thank you for that. In the spirit of the name of this convening, Hidden Figures, we're now going to talk about a woman in history who is not normally recognized for her contributions. The person can be local or a statewide woman or national figure who's made a contribution to you and inspired you to do the work that you are doing. And so we're going to go in the same order. We'll start with Professor Ringhan. Are you ready?
I'm ready, sure, thank you. So I thought a lot about this, and I decided that I wanted to kind of tell the story of a story that is not directly about voting, but it is about equality and equal citizenship. And that's the story of Sharon Frontiero. Some of you may know that name because you went to law school. Sharon Frontiero was one of Ruth Bader Ginsburg's clients. She was a white woman, and she was a lieutenant in the Air Force. And in 1973, she married her husband, who was a college student. And when she married her college student husband, she went to the military and she said, I'm now married, my husband is a dependent, I want to sign up for the additional stipend support and housing support that is given to married people. And the military turned her down. And it turned out that there was a rule that allowed men upon their marriage to automatically get these enhanced dependent benefits. But female soldiers couldn't get the same benefits. They had to prove that their husband was actually financially dependent on them. And that made Sharon Frontiero angry, and she kind of embraced that anger, like Justice Ward, and went with it and litigated with her attorney, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. And it was one of the trio of cases that then Attorney Ginsburg used to move the ball forward on gender equality under the Equal Protection Clause. But that's not actually what impresses me most about Sharon Frontiero. What I like about her story is less about what she did in 1973 than what she did 40 years later, in 2012. After her case was litigated, Sharon Frontiero dropped out of public life. She wasn't a public figure. She didn't have a public presence. She wasn't an activist. She just kind of went back to her own life. But in 2012, her attention was drawn to another woman's situation, another soldier, Tracy Cooper Harris. And Tracy Cooper Harris was a Black woman who had served for 12 years in the US Army, including extensive service in Iraq. And when she left service and developed health consequences related to her service in the armed forces, the US Army refused to recognize her same-sex marriage and refused to give her wife benefits that were routinely given to the spouses of other disabled veterans. And what Sharon Frontiero did when she heard that story was she went back into the public limelight and she embraced Tracy Cooper Harris's fight as her own. She understood that it was the same battle and it was the same fight, and she knew how to be an ally, and she jumped in and she did it. And that's what I like about her story.
Wonderful. And that underscores just the idea that equality is not divisible. It either exists for all or not at all. And that anytime that principle is threatened, then it's a threat to everyone else's entitlement to equal treatment. Thank you for that, Professor. Moving on to Justice Sears.
Well, okay, so Professor Washington, you already mentioned this lady, but I too had thought about this question hard and long before this program. And I'm sorry, I'm just a big fan of Shirley Chisholm. You know, I know that Netflix or Hulu or somebody is going to be doing a documentary on her soon. She was a very, very interesting woman. She is a woman of, I think she always considered herself a I don't know, is it Barbados? She was from Barbados. Actually, she was born in Brooklyn, but she spent a lot of her time, a lot of her childhood in Barbados. That's why she had that little accent. My husband, who was deputy mayor of New York City under Ed Koch, actually got to know her very well. She was an interesting woman for the time because I grew up during the time of Shirley Chisholm, and I watched her speak at the, believe it or not, I'm old enough to remember her speaking at the convention and all that. First African-American woman in Congress, first African-American woman to run for president, first woman to get the nomination on the Democratic side. Interesting woman. She was a feminist and active in the civil rights movement, and a former educator who really got her start by volunteering for a campaign for somebody who was running for judge in Brooklyn, the first Black man who actually ended up winning a judgeship in Brooklyn, and her career took off after that. But it was very interesting, and it goes again back to that timeline that you put up. There was always sort of a division between, you know, are you going to be active in the civil rights movement, or are you going to be active in the women's rights movement? And if you were a Black woman, which we are, you know, I mean, I found it as difficult being Black as it was being a woman, because as Shirley Chisholm always says, men are men, Black or white, it doesn't matter. So, but she seemed to be really good friends with Bella Abzug and all the feminists at that time. Very, very good friends with people in the civil rights movement, broke down barriers and took risks that most people, men, women, Black or white, were not willing to take it. And she had challenges later in life as a result of that, and was rejected by both some of the white feminists who were making deals to go with other candidates, pragmatic, what they saw as pragmatic deals. The same deals that were made in the parade that would have put the Deltas at the very end of the parade. Although I understand that Ida B. Wells from Chicago jumped into parade for so good for her. When the Illinois delegation walked by, but it was all white up until then. But anyway, Shirley Chisholm is my hero. She's not a hidden figure, but she is getting more recognition now with a park going to be named after her, maybe a small bridge, and this documentary.
Great choice. And I think, her activism at that intersection of women's rights and civil rights for Black people,
yes,
highlights the point about equality not being divisible. Like, it's all the same fight, right? Discrimination on the basis of race, gender, sexual orientation is all a threat to equality and equal treatment under the law. And so, those of us who find ourselves at that intersection don't get to carve ourselves in half or thirds and choose which part of ourselves we're going to advocate for. We're advocating for equal access and opportunity.
That's right.
I'm looking forward to the movie.
Yeah,
Yes. Attorney Greer, who's your hidden figure? And you're muted.
Yeah, and unfortunately mine also isn't hidden, but not often discussed, but a woman I've admired since I was in college, and that's Fannie Lou Hamer. And one of the reasons I admire her is because going back to the quote you put up about Ruth Bader Ginsburg, using whatever talents I have to do all that I can, and dropped out of school at 12 to help take care of her family. She was in her 40s when she realized that she had the right to vote. And then not only did she go and try and vote, she tried to organize others to help them to vote. When the Democratic Party in Mississippi was refusing to allow Blacks to participate in the political process, she founded her own party. And this was in her 40s, a woman who stopped going to school at 12. And so, when I get weary, when I'm like, I'm too old, I'm too tired, when it's like I shouldn't have to stand in line 2.5 hours to vote, she was fired for just trying to go register to vote. And I think there are many days when we feel like, we've taken 2 steps forward and 20 back, and you get tired. And then I think about someone like Fannie Lou Hamer, who picked up this battle in her 40s and challenged the status quo by founding her own political party, and all that she went through just to try and register to vote. And I realized I'm not so tired anymore. I can do this. And so, if you have to stand in line 2.5 hours or 4 hours, if you have to take your chair, your medicine, your water, your book, your iPad, whatever, do it. And do the short-term things that are not fair and work towards the long-term things. And Fannie Lou Hamer embodies that for me. So,
oh, excellent example. And I think that one, we've got to plan our vote. That seems to be the instructions that we are being given. And you're right, there's some obstacles that are absolutely not fair, and we have to rise to the occasion anyway and be focused on making sure that those barriers don't exist for those coming behind us. And I'm with you, Carlisa, about drawing on the experiences of those who have come before us, because they encountered obstacles that we just don't have to encounter. And because of their sacrifice, we are in a much better position to meet the challenges of our day, and drawing strength from those examples is, I think, helpful and instructive and inspiring. So thank you. Thank you. Attorney Nguyen?
Thank you. Like Justice Ward Sears, I also actually wrestled with this question for a long time. As a progressive woman of color who grew up in the American South, the historical figures from whom I've always drawn inspiration for my voting rights work are largely Black civil rights leaders. But because I recognize that there's incredible power to also having role models who share your specific cultural upbringing and racial experiences in this country. I did want to highlight an Asian American woman in history who inspires my work. So the woman I actually would like to highlight today is my sister B, who made history just 3 years ago when she became the first Vietnamese American and first progressive Asian American woman to ever serve in the Georgia General Assembly. She ran for Stacey Abrams' old state house seat when Leader Abrams stepped up to run for governor. B had never had any political ambition. Her background is in nonprofit and public policy. And when she decided to run for office, she was told by many people to wait her turn, that she would be better behind the scenes as a chief of staff or as somebody's campaign manager. But she saw an opportunity to fight for women, for immigrants, for people of color, and for other marginalized communities more effectively by taking power on the inside. Because unfortunately, our laws are still too often made by white men who a lot of times are disconnected from the lived experiences of so many of the people that they're supposed to serve. And so having my sister in the state legislature has not only been so inspiring to me, but it's also actually enabled me to do my job better. In 2018, Advancing Justice Atlanta, along with a number of other voting rights organizations, sued the Secretary of State to challenge the exact match voter registration policy, which in advance of the November 2018 governor's race had frozen about 53,000 voter registration applications, 80% of those belonging to people of color. After that lawsuit was filed, along with a slew of other litigation that was filed leading up to the election in 2018 and that were filed during the election, then the Georgia General Assembly actually introduced a bill to address some of the issues that were raised through those lawsuits. And my sister and I were able to work together to come up with some language that, for the most part, gutted the exact match policy. There's still a piece of it that we're challenging through litigation, so it's not been entirely gutted, but we were able to take down a large part of it. And so that's the woman that I would like to highlight today.
Beautiful. Thank you. Thank you. Dean Cox, who's your hidden figure?
Well, I would certainly endorse all of the women who've been discussed earlier, for sure. You know, when I was thinking about hidden figures, I was thinking about how did I learn about women's rights and women's history. And I thought, you know, the way that I grew up and the way that I was taught history was like so much of what we're all realizing now, maybe particularly in the South, but probably all over the country. Many of us got a sanitized version of history, a sanitized version of everything from the Civil War to racial history to the history of how we treated indigenous peoples and everything in between. But I think the sum total of all that I got about women's rights was Susan B. Anthony, period. So that brings me to my choice of my hidden figure is Alice Paul, because it was not until much later in life that I understood or even had heard of who Alice Paul was. But she has become this fascinating figure to me as a hidden figure. And sometime, I think over the summer, I think public television had a series on the 19th Amendment and really did a lot of incorporating her story into that, if any of you want to look for that. But she was a pretty typical Quaker child that grew up in the Northeast in the New Jersey area, from an educated family that centered in the early 1900s, right around the turn of the century, to get an education. She earned a college degree in biology. She went on to get a master's degree in sociology. So her family obviously believed in women getting an education, which was pretty progressive for the time. And then they sent her abroad. Her mother was a suffragist. So she had gone to meetings with her mother to talk about the right of women potentially to vote. So she was schooled in the concept, but being a Quaker, I can imagine it was, you know, pretty oriented toward the rules and structure of Quakers. But she was sent to, or chose to go to England to study abroad and study sociology. And there she came upon a very active women's movement that was going on in England in the early 1900s. And she met some really radical, for the times, women suffragists in England who were all about very militant ideas. She came up on a crowd that were listening to a woman out on sort of a stump speech, and they were booing her and not listening to her. And she finally, when the crowd dispersed, wanted to find out who this woman was and befriended her and sort of became a devotee of her style of militantly going after change. I think in the words of our great late John Lewis, she made herself some good trouble that not many people of the time thought was good trouble, but the strategies and the tactics of the people she associated with, the Pankhurst were their names, some of the women in England, were to be pretty militant. I mean, literally throwing rocks to break windows, marching, causing good trouble to get attention to their cause. So in the 3 years or so that she was in England, she really sort of took up this battle cry, came back to America a changed woman, and got involved in the suffragist movement and really became at odds with some of the women who'd been working in the fields for a long time, trying to, you know, push and cajole the men to change the laws. They weren't making a lot of progress. Well, she got in there with her militant tactics and started doing things that really got attention. The first one that really was a big one was the big parade in 1913, which Professor Washington Hicks mentioned earlier. There were good and bad parts to it. The good part is that it brought thousands of women to Washington, which had never been done. It was done on the day before the inauguration of President Woodrow Wilson. So it took a lot of thunder from his inauguration. But they did, of course, invite Black women to march at the back of the line, the proverbial back of the bus. So there was still a big racial divide in the movement. But over the next decade or so, from 1913 into 1919 for sure, Alice Paul really became a force and really became a thorn in the side of President Woodrow Wilson. She led all kinds of protests. And as America entered World War I around 1917, when everybody in the country sort of came together for the war effort, she and some of her colleagues began to be the silent sentinels right outside the White House. And they would literally stand in front of the White House gates so that every time the president drove in or out, he would have to see them. And at first he kind of waved at them condescendingly, but they stood there in the snow, I mean, for months on end about the right of women to vote in the war effort. And a lot of people got mad because they thought you shouldn't protest a president in the middle of a war, and you shouldn't protest America in the middle of a war. But she kept at it with a lot of militant tactics to get attention to the effort. While a lot of women were still working on the state effort, she wanted a national change in the Constitution. And ultimately, her efforts had much to do with, in 1918 and 19, the passage of the 19th Amendment and its ultimate ratification. She didn't stop then. She went on to actually write the language of the Equal Rights Amendment, which was finally, you know, for years and years, just like the 19th Amendment, it wouldn't get admitted for debate into Congress. It finally was put onto the floor. But of course, The time ran out, at least under the initial debate, for it to receive ratification, but she was there throughout the debate for women to gain rights to vote, to be equal participants in government. And she really, in my book, has never gotten her due for what she's done for women and the rights we have today.
Well, I think that underscores the fact that there are so many different ways to contribute. The only wrong choice is to not contribute at all. Everyone has to, according to their own talents and abilities and access and passion, figure out how to move the ball forward. And so as we draw this conversation to a close, my last question for all of my panelists centers on the advice that they would give young women in this particular moment, at this particular time, based on all of your expertise and experience, about how to move forward and what they can and should be doing. Because the fight is not yet won. Despite the firsts that we are experiencing, there are still firsts to be achieved. And what advice would you give young women who want to be a part of the expansion of the franchise to include more women and greater access to the ballot box, and also inspiring them to be the politicians that we're voting for, to throw their hat in the ring and actually be a part of the change that we need? So I am going to start with Professor Ringhan.
Thank you. And again, it's been a real pleasure to be here. So I guess I would like to leave women with a message about running for office. So we hear a lot about how women don't run for office because they lack confidence or similar types of things. You know, and I'm sure for some people that's true, but sometimes women don't run for office because they see what happens to women who run for office. It's a form of being astute. The risks are greater. You will be judged and you will be treated differently. And it's not an easy path. And I think it is okay to know that, to not feel like your hesitation is because there is something wrong with you. Your hesitation may be because there is something wrong with the world. And that's the thing that is real, and it makes it hard, but it's also what makes it worth it. Because the arc of the moral universe doesn't bend toward justice, it gets bent by people and activists who do things. So step up and do it, and find your mentors. Reach out to these women, reach out to the women you know, find your support group, and just do it.
Excellent. Be an arc bender. Justice Ward Sears?
Yeah. So can I just tack on a comment to what the professor just said? It is harder for a woman when you're running for office. It's hard to be a woman in public life. I remember standing out on street corners in the 90s with Dean Cox, who was just Kathy Cox at the time. I was running again and she was running, and we were both we'd be on panel discussions and we'd talk about how people talk about our husbands when no one's really interested in another candidate's wife, or our hair, how does our hair look, our makeup, our clothes, all that kind of stuff that just isn't a part of the experience for men who are running for office. So yes, it is harder. It's still harder. I mean, you saw the 2016 campaign. But on to the question, which is what would I tell young people? It's just a few things. First, young voters account for about half of the voting population, which makes them an extremely powerful political force. Yet older Americans are more likely to vote. And that's a shame, because if younger Americans exercise that power, they can actually sway the election. And they should. We need young voters. We need them to understand how important They're an interesting demographic. They're much more diverse. They have a different worldview, thank God, than generations before. And they've had hard experience, their own hard experiences. They've been hard hit by the recession, hardest hit by the recession. Now it's the pandemic and the last few years. So we need younger folks to get out and make a difference, because the vote that they make now is going to have an incredible impact on their future and the future of their children.
Great advice. And I know there are a significant voting block in the state of Georgia, in particular. And I hope that all the young people will take your advice and exercise their franchise. Attorney Greer, advice for the younger generation?
Two things. First, I want to thank Dean Cox for telling that story about Alice Paul. I learned a lot from a PBS special that featured Alice Paul and all that they went through to get the right to vote. When they went on a food strike, they had to be force-fed because they weren't going to let them die in prison. So she was an interesting figure. But the thing that struck me most about that PBS special was the fact, and I had never really thought about it, that when women won the right to vote, the only people who could vote were men. In other words, women had to convince somebody who potentially held all the power to give up power, someone who potentially did not have something in common with them, that this is in your best interest. And, you know, again, in these days of toxic political climates, I think people sometimes are unwilling to try and work with others who are not like them. But I think the story of both the civil rights movement, the women's voting rights movement, is that you have to be able to form alliances with unlikely allies and be able to talk to people about why something that is seemingly not in their best interest is really for the best. So don't forget that when the 19th Amendment passed, only men could vote. I think that's an important point. And then again, second, please make a plan to vote this year. It is a sacred right. Don't take it for granted. There are so many people who went through so much so that we can go to the polls and vote. And despite all of the obstacles, and I'm not playing them down, you know, we aren't going to be beaten and bloodied. We aren't going to be fired, most likely, for going to the polls. We aren't going to have to leave our homes for threats that we're going to be burned out of our homes or lynched because we try and go vote. And so, yes, it may be inconvenient. You may have to think ahead about what you plan to do, whether you're voting by mail, voting in person, wearing a mask, taking a day off from work because you don't know how long it's going to take. Yes, it's convenient. Yes, there are obstacles. No, it's not fair, but make a plan to vote and vote.
And something that I've been sharing with friends, family, and anybody who will listen is if the right to vote was not so important, there wouldn't be so much effort expended to ensure that fewer people exercise it. So it must be important, and we have an obligation out of respect for the sacrifices that were made by those who come before us to create the option to exercise that option. So thank you, Attorney Greer. Attorney Nguyen.
Thank you. I have two messages, and the first one is just a general message to all young women, and that is we have to collectively participate to build a better future that includes all of us. And the way that you can participate can take a lot of different forms. I read Dr. Carol Anderson's One Person, No Vote book that chronicles the history of voter suppression in the South. It's an incredible book. And one of the chapters that really struck me was her coverage of Doug Jones's race for Senate in 2017 during the special election, which of course was a very surprising victory on his part. But what she does in that chapter is she just talks about all of the people in the social justice ecosphere that were responsible for making that victory happen, from the people who had been building power in that community and registering voters for years, to the lawyers who litigated to challenge voter suppression laws, to the people who drove voters to the polls. There's a place for everybody, and it takes the whole village, honestly. And I just loved the way that she captured that. So if running for office is not your thing, there are so many areas to plug into this process. And my second message is really to women who are thinking about running for office. And you heard earlier Professor Washington say that women have to be repeatedly invited and urged to run for office before they're likely to consider it. Even though women who run for office are actually more likely than men to be successful. And in Georgia, women make up more than 50% of the population, but less than 30% of the Georgia legislature. And that statistic is across the board true nationally as well. And so my message to those women is you belong in office, and frankly, our country needs you in office. And if you think you're not good enough, if you are good enough, you're smart enough, you're qualified enough, you are ready enough, and you are just enough.
Oh, thank you. And I read Professor Anderson's book as well. That particular chapter was so phenomenal about the collective effort. And she also talked about the strategies, right? And so one of the things I love about history is it reveals the strategies that were used. This didn't, all of these accomplishments just didn't happen overnight, and they were the result of a collective effort. And I hope when we look back at our history in the places where we didn't act collaboratively, that we realize that had we done so, all of us would be farther along through that collective effort. So thank you for that, Attorney Nguyen. And last but certainly not least, Dean Cox.
Well, I just want to say amen, amen, amen to Fee's comments, to all of your advice. And so I'll just finish with a statement from Justice Ginsburg, the late Justice Ginsburg, who said that women belong in all the places where decisions are made. And that's from elected office to corporate boards, to county commissions, to school boards, wherever decisions are being made about the larger community, women need to be at the table. Women need to be there in parity. If not, like she said, when will there be enough women on the Supreme Court? When there are 9. So nobody's ever said anything about there being 9 male justices, and I'm not going to say a thing about there being 9 female justices. Until there are 9, they're not enough. But we need to be vigilant in order to get there, because the rights that we have gained today can be taken away, and we are living through those times. With the Shelby decision, we have seen hard-fought rights be taken away with one action of a legislature. With one more addition to the United States Supreme Court, we stand to see other rights be taken away from us. We need to be vigilant and to wake up a younger generation that has just accepted that lots of things in reproductive freedom were always going to be available to them and are in jeopardy, as well as voting rights for all of us. They can be taken away, and there are efforts to take them away by people who have other agendas. And so women need to be at those tables where those decisions are made. Women need to be a part of the power when those decisions are made. And I hope that some of the things we're living through now will really motivate a younger generation of women to get out and be a part of the new generation to make sure that we can protect those rights. And if you don't see yourself as one of those power brokers or candidates, then look at the woman you know next to you, or the woman that lives down the street from you, or the woman you go to church or synagogue with, and ask her, just like we're talking about these women that need to be asked. If you're not the candidate, ask the women you know. Tell them you will help them run a good campaign and help them win. And that's the way we'll do it.
Oh, wonderful closing remarks. So I am going to turn it over to Veronica. Thank all of you for your insight, for your brilliance, and for sharing the personal stories that I think will help people in our audience reflect on, their own capacity to make important, enduring contributions to this shared effort. So thank you.
Thank you all so much. What an amazing discussion. On behalf of GAWL, GABWA, and the Gate City Bar Association, we want to thank our moderator, Professor Washington Hicks. We want to thank our panelists for this amazing discussion. As was mentioned earlier, our right to vote is a sacred right, I believe is the way that Carlise describes it. It is a right that people have fought and died for, and so we must protect it at all costs. So again, thank you so much for this very productive and timely discussion. Just as a reminder, if you are in Georgia, October 5th is the deadline to register to vote in the November 3rd elections. Early in-person voting runs from October 12th to October 30th. Do not wait till October 30th. Also, you may request an absentee ballot through the Georgia Secretary of State's website at www.mvp.sos.ga.gov. You may request an absentee ballot on or before October 30th. Again, don't wait until October 30th. Again, we thank you so much for joining us this evening for this amazing discussion. And Kim, did you want to say anything on behalf of GABWA? Again, thank you, GABWA and Gate City Bar, for making this happen, as well as our panelists. And thank you for joining us, everyone, and have a great evening.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.